Welcome. If you're settling in for the night, looking for something calm to accompany you into rest, you've found the right place. Tonight we're going to explore a question that might seem simple at first, but reveals itself to be remarkably complex. How do you bring fire indoors without filling your home with smoke? It's a problem that faced people across the cold regions of this continent for thousands of years, and the solutions they developed were elegant, patient, and deeply intelligent. There's no need to rush through this. We'll move slowly, examining how smoke behaves, how wind can be made an ally, and how three different groups of people living in three different landscapes each found their own answer to the same fundamental challenge. Let the details unfold at their own pace. Let yourself relax into the steady rhythm of the story. So take a breath, get comfortable. And let's begin by understanding the problem itself, the invisible enemy. There are forces in nature that announce themselves clearly. Thunder arrives with sound, lightning with light, wind bends the trees and makes its presence known. But smoke is different. Smoke is quiet. It drifts, it hangs in the air without warning, and by the time you notice it, the room is already thick with it. For thousands of years, people across the northern reaches of this continent faced a problem that was both simple and profound. Winter required warmth. Warmth required fire. But fire, in the process of giving heat, produced something that could not be ignored. Smoke was not merely an inconvenience, it was a danger. A shelter sealed against the cold became a trap. The air inside, the very air needed to breathe, turned heavy and bitter. Eyes watered, throats tightened, children coughed, and if the smoke was thick enough, if it lingered too long, it could render a person unconscious. It could kill. Smoke is a cloud of many things. Unburnt particles of wood or grass, water vapor released as fuel breaks down, invisible gases, some of them poisonous, all of them unwelcome in the lungs. When fire burns, it does not simply disappear the material it consumes, it transforms it, and much of what is transformed rises into the air as smoke. The chemical process is complex, but the result is always the same. What was solid becomes gas and particulate suspended in the air, moving with currents you cannot see. The nature of smoke is to rise. Heat makes air expand. Expanded air is lighter than the cold air around it, and so it climbs. Smoke, carried by this rising heat, moves upward. This is a fact of physics that required no books to observe. Anyone who has ever sat beside a fire knows that smoke does not fall. It lifts. It seeks height. It gathers at the ceiling, pooling there like an invisible lake turned upside down. But this rising tendency creates a problem. If you are inside a shelter, the smoke rises to the roof. If there is no way out, it accumulates. The warmth you sought is buried beneath a layer of choking haze. You cannot see across the room. You cannot breathe without coughing. The fire that was supposed to save you becomes the thing that drives you out into the cold. You are faced with a choice that is no choice at all. Freeze outside or suffocate inside. The simplest solution would seem obvious. Cut a hole in the roof, let the smoke escape. And this does work, to a point. The smoke rises through the opening and is gone. But in doing so, it takes something else with it. It takes the heat. All of it, or nearly all of it. A hole in the roof becomes a chimney. And a chimney does not merely allow smoke to leave, it pulls air. The hot air from the fire rushes upward and out, and as it goes, it creates a vacuum behind it. Nature abhors vacuum. Cold air from outside is drawn in to replace what was lost. This cold air flows in through every gap, every seam, every crack in the walls. It flows across the floor like water finding the lowest path. It chills the feet and legs of anyone sitting nearby. The fire must be fed constantly, burning more and more fuel just to maintain the same level of warmth. The dwelling becomes a wind tunnel, a tube through which air rushes without pause. The heat you generate is lost almost as quickly as it is made. This is not merely inefficient. In a land where fuel must be gathered by hand, where every piece of wood or dried grass represents hours of labour, waste is a serious matter. A fire that devours resources without providing comfort is not sustainable. It is not a solution, it is a problem dressed as one. You might as well burn your supplies in a pile outside, At least then you would not have the illusion of progress. Smoke behaves in ways that are predictable once you understand it. It seeks the easiest path, it follows pressure gradients, moving from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. It clings to surfaces that are cooler than itself, depositing soot and tar as it makes contact. Some of the moisture in the smoke condenses on cold walls, mixing with the particles to create a dark, sticky residue. This is why the inside of a poorly ventilated shelter becomes stained and blackened over time. The smoke does not simply pass through, it leaves its mark, but smoke can also be guided. It can be nudged, coaxed along a route if the structure around it is built with care. If you understand where the smoke wants to go, you can create a path for it. If you understand what makes smoke move, you can design a system that works with its nature rather than against it, but it cannot be ignored, and it cannot be sealed away. The challenge then was not to eliminate smoke, it was to manage it. To create a system where the smoke could leave, but the heat could stay, where fresh air could enter, but drafts could be controlled, where a family could sit in warmth and clarity, breathing clean air while the fire burned steadily at the centre of their home. This was the problem, and solving it required more than luck. It required observation, patience, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. It required watching smoke on 1,000 different days in 1,000 different conditions and slowly, carefully learning its language. The rising column. Understanding smoke meant watching it. Not once, but across seasons, across years. It meant noticing where it gathered and where it dispersed. It meant seeing patterns that only revealed themselves through repetition. It meant sitting in the cold dawn and observing how smoke behaved when the air was perfectly still. It meant watching again in the evening when the wind picked up and seeing how everything changed. Smoke does not behave randomly. It follows rules. The first and most obvious rule is that it rises with heat. A fire creates warmth, and warmth creates movement in the air. The air directly above the flames expands and becomes less dense. This lighter air is pushed upward by the heavier, colder air around it. The smoke suspended in this rising current travels with it. The hotter the fire, the faster the rise. The column of smoke is not merely carried by the air. It is the air, transformed by heat into something visible. But the rising is not uniform. Smoke does not spread evenly across a ceiling in a smooth layer. It forms a column, a pillar of grey or white that moves straight up from the source of the fire. If you have a small fire in the centre of a room, the smoke will rise in a narrow stream. If the fire is large, the column is wider, but it remains a column. It remains concentrated. This matters because it means that smoke can be direct, and if you know where the column will form, you can place an opening directly above it. You can create a path of least resistance and the smoke will follow. The second rule is that smoke seeks the path of least resistance. If there are two openings in a roof, one large and one small, the smoke will favour the larger one. The larger opening offers less resistance to flow. If one opening is directly above the fire and another is off to the side, the smoke will move toward the one above. It does not think. It does not choose in any conscious way, but it follows the gradient of pressure and temperature, and in doing so it becomes predictable. You can anticipate where it will go. You can design around its tendencies. The third rule is that smoke can be influenced by airflow. A breeze moving across the top of a dwelling can change where the smoke goes. If wind flows over an opening, it creates a drop in pressure at that spot. This drop acts like a gentle pull, drawing the smoke toward it. The stronger the wind, the stronger the pull. People living with these fires every day noticed this pattern. When the wind blew from the north, adjusting the opening to face south made the smoke leave more cleanly. Over time, this observation became knowledge, refined and passed down. Smoke also clings. When it encounters a cold surface, it slows. The particles in the smoke are small, but they have mass. When they touch a surface, some of them stick. Some of the moisture in the smoke condenses, creating tiny droplets that hold the particles in place. This is why the inside of a poorly ventilated shelter becomes stained and dark. The smoke does not simply pass through, it leaves traces, it builds up. Over time, the ceiling blackens, the walls darken, and everything inside takes on the smell of burnt wood. This smell can become permanent, absorbed into the fibres of clothing, the grain of wooden tools, even the skin of the people who live there. But there is another quality of smoke that is less visible and harder to measure. Smoke is heavy with meaning. It marks the presence of fire. and fire is life. Where there is smoke, there is warmth. There is light. There is the ability to cook food, to dry clothing, to keep the cold at bay. Smoke, for all its danger, was also the signal that a home was inhabited, that people were surviving, that winter had not won. A column of smoke rising from a dwelling on a cold morning was proof of life, proof that the fire had been kept alive through the night, that the family inside was still there, still warm, still persisting. The people who lived in the northern landscapes of this continent understood all of this. They did not write it down in books. They did not create diagrams or publish treatises, but they knew. They knew because they lived with fire every day. They watched how smoke moved in the morning when the air was still and heavy. They watched how it shifted in the evening when the wind picked up and the temperature began to drop. They learned which woods produced thick smoke and which burned clean. They learned that a fire built with dry, dense wood created less smoke than a fire built with green branches still full of sap. They learned that a fire fed slowly, with small additions of fuel, burned more completely than a fire stacked high all at once. A fire that burns completely produces less smoke because more of the fuel is converted to heat and less is left as unburnt particles. This knowledge was not static. It was not something you learned once and then forgot. It was passed from one generation to the next, refined with each telling. A grandmother would show a child how to bank the coals at night, covering them with ash so they would smoulder until morning, holding their heat through the dark hours. A father would teach his son how to read the wind, how to feel which direction it was coming from without looking at trees or flags, just by turning his face and noticing where the cold touched first. A mother would demonstrate which grasses made the best kindling, which birch bark could be peeled in sheets for starting fires, even in the rain. This was survival, yes, but it was also craft. It was the careful cultivation of comfort in a world that did not offer it freely. The failed solutions. To understand what made the Native American solutions remarkable, it helps to see what others tried. Across the ocean in medieval Europe, the problem of heating a home was approached differently. The materials were different. The climate was different. The social structures were different. But the fundamental problem was the same: how to bring fire indoors without dying from the smoke. The results, however, were not elegant. They were not efficient. They were, set in many cases, barely adequate. The typical medieval hearth was a large open fireplace built into a stone wall. The fire burned on a raised platform or directly on the floor, and above it a massive chimney rose through the structure. The chimney was often wide enough for a person to stand inside. It was built from stone or brick mortared together with clay or lime. It was a permanent structure, heavy and imposing, and it was designed to do one thing: carry smoke out of the building. In this, it succeeded. The smoke did leave. It rose through the chimney and escaped into the open air, but the cost was high. The fire had to be enormous. The flames needed to be large and hot to create enough rising heat to push the smoke all the way up and out through the tall chimney. This required a constant supply of wood, and wood, even in forested Europe, was not unlimited. Entire forests were cut down to feed the hearths of castles and manor houses. Villages competed for access to woodlands. Laws were passed to regulate who could cut trees and where. The demand for firewood shaped the landscape, creating open fields where forests had once stood. Even with a large fire, the heat did not stay in the room. The chimney acted as a powerful vacuum. It pulled the hot air upward and expelled it. Cold air rushed in from every door, every window, every crack in the walls to replace what was lost. The people sitting near the fire might feel warmth on their faces, but their backs were cold, their feet were cold. The room, despite the roaring flames, remained drafty and uncomfortable. You could stand with one side of your body nearly scorched by the heat and the other side chilled by the draft. The experience was not comfort. It was a negotiation between two forms of discomfort. Stone walls and floors made the problem worse. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. In a well-designed system, this can be an advantage. Stone can act as a thermal battery, storing warmth during the day and releasing it at night. But in a medieval hall with a massive, inefficient fireplace, the stone simply stayed cold. The heat from the fire never had a chance to warm the structure itself. It went straight up the chimney and was gone. The stone walls, thick and solid as they were, remained cold to the touch. The The floor was cold, the air was cold, only the small zone directly in front of the fire offered any relief. The result was that medieval European homes, even grand ones, were notoriously cold. Chronicles and letters from the period are filled with complaints about the chill. People wore layers of clothing indoors. They wrapped themselves in furs and heavy woolen cloaks even while sitting inside. They hung heavy tapestries on the walls, not primarily for decoration, but for insulation, creating a barrier between the living space and the freezing stone. They slept in beds with thick curtains drawn around them to trap what little warmth their bodies produced. The fire, for all its size and fuel consumption, provided only a small zone of comfort. Step away from the hearth, and the cold returned immediately. This was not due to a lack of intelligence. Medieval builders were skilled. They understood arches and buttresses and the properties of stone. They built cathedrals that still stand today, structures of astonishing complexity and beauty. But they had not solved the problem of balance. They had not learned how to keep the heat while expelling the smoke. They had chosen one over the other, prioritizing smoke removal over heat retention, and the choice left them cold. The technology existed to build tall chimneys, but not to make those chimneys efficient. In contrast, the solutions developed on this continent were born from different priorities. Fuel was often scarce. Wood, especially on the open plains, had to be carried from distant groves or traded for. Every piece mattered. Wastefulness was not an option. The fire had to be small, controlled and efficient. It had to provide warmth without consuming endless resources. And it had to do so in a way that allowed people to live comfortably, not huddled in a single corner of the room, but spread throughout the space, going about their daily activities without constantly seeking the fire. The structures that achieved this did not rely on brute force. They did not try to overpower the physics of heat and smoke with size and volume. Instead, they worked with those physics. They observed how air moved. They noticed how wind created pressure differences. They saw that smoke, if given the right path, would leave on its own without taking all the heat with it, and they built homes that embodied this understanding. The engineering was invisible in a sense. It was woven into the shape of the building, the placement of openings, the materials used. It did not announce itself. It simply worked. The Winds Partnership. The Great Plains stretch across the centre of the continent, a vast expanse of grass and sky. There are few trees. The land rolls gently, rising and falling in long, slow waves. The horizon is distant. The sky feels larger here than it does in other places, as if there is more of it pressing down. In every direction you can see for miles. The openness is profound. There is nowhere to hide, no valleys to tuck into, no dense forests to break the force of the elements. And the wind never stops. It blows from the north in winter, carrying cold that can freeze a person in minutes if they are unprepared. It blows from the south in summer, hot and dry, baking the land until the grass turns brown and brittle. It shifts with the seasons, but it never truly ceases. Even on what might seem like a calm day, there is always movement in the air. The grass bends with it, creating waves that ripple across the prairie like water. The few trees that manage to grow, usually along creek beds or in protected ravines, lean away from the prevailing winds, their trunks and branches permanently bent by years of constant pressure. Everything on the plains exists in relation to the wind. For the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot and other groups who lived on this open land, the wind was not something to be hidden from. There was nowhere to hide, no mountains to shelter behind, no thick forests to break its force. The wind was simply part of life, as constant as the sun, as unavoidable as the changing seasons. You learn to live with it. You learn to read it, to understand its moods, to anticipate its shifts. You learned that it could be cold and cutting or warm and gentle. You learned that it carried information, the scent of rain, the smell of buffalo, the sound of distant thunder. These people followed the buffalo. The great herds moved across the plains with the seasons, following the growth of new grass, seeking water, avoiding the deepest snows, and the people moved with them. This was not random wandering. It was a careful, deliberate pattern, repeated year after year. The routes were known. The campsites were familiar. But the movement itself was constant. This meant that homes had to be portable. A permanent structure, built from stone or heavy timber, was not practical. What was needed was something that could be taken down in hours, carried on the backs of horses, or loaded onto travois and rebuilt at the next camp. Something light but also strong, something that could withstand the wind without being torn apart. The answer was the teepee. To someone seeing it for the first time, it might appear simple. A cone of poles covered in bison hides. The poles leaned together at the top, their bases spread in a circle on the ground. The hides were sewn together and wrapped around the frame, overlapping to create a continuous surface. At a glance, it seemed like nothing more than a tent, a temporary shelter with no particular sophistication. But simplicity, in this case, was the result of careful thought. Every part of the tipi had a purpose. Every measurement mattered. The angle of the poles, the diameter of the base, the height of the structure. All of these had been refined over generations. The result was a dwelling that was remarkably efficient, remarkably comfortable, and remarkably well adapted to the environment in which it existed. The shape itself was significant. A cone is aerodynamic. Wind flowing over a rounded surface does not push against it with full force. It slides over, diverted around the curve. The air accelerates as it moves up the slope, but it does not create the kind of direct pressure that would strain the structure. A square or rectangular structure would catch the wind, creating pressure points that could collapse walls or tear coverings. But a cone sheds the wind naturally. The force of the gale is distributed evenly around the structure, and no single point bears too much strain. The poles support each other, locked together at the top in a configuration that is inherently stable. The teepee was not large. Most were between 12 and 20 feet in diameter at the base. The height varied, but a typical teepee stood perhaps 15 feet tall at the peak. Inside there was enough room for a family to sleep, to store their belongings, and to gather around a small fire. The space was cosy without being cramped. The circular shape meant there were no corners, no dead spaces where cold air could settle. Everything was within reach. Everything had its place. The fire was placed at the centre. Not off to one side, but exactly in the middle. This central placement was critical. Heat radiates outward in all directions. If the fire is in the centre of a circular space, every part of that space receives warmth equally. There are no cold corners, no dead zones where the heat cannot reach. The people sitting around the fire, arranged in a circle, all benefited equally from its warmth. This democratic distribution of heat was not accidental, it was designed. But the real genius of the tipi was not in its shape or its size, it was in how it managed the smoke. And this management was active, not passive. It required understanding, attention, and constant adjustment. The cone's purpose. At the top of the teepee, where the poles converged, there was an opening. This was the smoke hole. It was not covered. It was not fixed. It was not simply a gap left by the structure. It was an adjustable opening, controlled by two long poles that were separate from the main structure of the dwelling. These poles extended upward from the ground, reaching higher than the tipi itself, and they were attached to two large flaps of hide. These flaps extended from the edges of the smoke hole, rising upward and outward like wings. They were sometimes called ears. The image is apt. They gave the teepee a listening quality, as if it were attuned to the wind, ready to respond. The poles allowed the occupants to shift the position of these flaps from inside the teepee without having to go outside into the cold or the storm. By moving the poles, by pushing or pulling them in different directions, you could open the smoke hole wider on one side or narrow it on another. You could angle the flaps to create a specific shape of opening. You could close them almost entirely in driving rain or snow, leaving just a small gap for the smoke. You could, in essence, tune the ventilation of the dwelling to match the wind conditions outside. This was not a passive system. It required attention. The person tending the fire also watched the smoke. If it began to drift downward, if it lingered inside the teepee instead of rising, cleanly out, adjustments were made. The poles were shifted, the flaps repositioned. It was a constant, gentle negotiation with the elements, but the adjustments were small. A few inches of movement could make all the difference. The system was sensitive, responsive, and remarkably effective. The key was to position the smoke hole opening on the downwind side of the tipi. If the wind was blowing from the north, the flaps were adjusted so that the northern side of the smoke hole was more closed and the southern side more open. This seems counterintuitive at first. One might think that the opening should face into the wind, allowing it to push the smoke out. but the opposite is true. And understanding why requires understanding how wind behaves when it encounters an obstacle. When wind flows over the curved surface of the tipi, it accelerates as it moves up and over the peak. This acceleration is not accidental. It is a consequence of the shape. As the air is forced to move over the curve, it speeds up. And when air speeds up, something interesting happens. The pressure drops. This is a fundamental principle of fluid dynamics, observed in nature in countless ways. It is the same principle that allows airplane wings to generate lift. Fast-moving air creates lower pressure than slow-moving air. At the top of the teepee, directly above the smoke hole, this accelerated air creates a zone of low pressure. This drop in pressure acts like a vacuum. It pulls the smoke upward and out. The faster the wind, the greater the acceleration, and the stronger the pull. The flaps, positioned to create an opening on the downwind side, channel this effect. They create a protected pocket where the low pressure can work without interference. The smoke is drawn out smoothly, steadily, without turbulence. People who built teepees did not need to know the name for this effect. They did not need to understand the mathematics. They simply saw that when they adjusted the flaps in a certain way, the smoke left more cleanly. They repeated what worked. They taught it to their children. And over generations, the technique became second nature. It became part of the knowledge that every person carried, as fundamental as knowing which plants were edible or how to track game. The flaps also served other purposes. In heavy rain, they could be angled to act as gutters, directing water away from the smoke hole so it would not drip onto the fire. The water would run down the outside of the flaps and fall to the ground away from the entrance. In a blizzard, they could be drawn almost completely closed, leaving only a small gap for the smoke while keeping out the driving snow. This flexibility was crucial. The weather on the plains could change rapidly. A calm morning could turn into a howling gale by afternoon. The tipi had to be able to respond to these changes, and the adjustable flaps made that possible. But the smoke hole was only half of the ventilation system. For smoke to leave the top of the teepee, air had to enter from below, and this too was carefully managed. This was where the second layer of engineering came into play, a feature that is often overlooked but absolutely essential to the system's success. The pressure game. Inside the teepee, there was a second layer. This was a lining often made from bison hide or, in later periods after contact with traders, canvas. It hung from the poles, starting several feet up from the ground and draping down to the floor. But it did not touch the outer wall of the teepee. There was a gap, a space of several inches, between the inner lining and the outer covering. This gap ran all the way around the perimeter of the dwelling, a continuous channel that was invisible from the outside but crucial to the function of the interior. This gap was intentional. It was the path for fresh air. It was the intake for the system, just as the smoke hole was the exhaust. The design of this channel was subtle but sophisticated, based on an understanding of how air moves and how temperature affects that movement. Cold air from outside the tipi seeped in under the bottom edge of the outer covering. This was unavoidable. The bison hides were lashed together with sinew or cord, and they were staked to the ground with wooden pegs, sometimes reinforced with stones placed along the base to hold the covering tight. But they could not create a perfect seal. The hides were organic material, and they shifted and moved with changes in humidity and temperature. They expanded when wet, contracted when dry. The ground was uneven, with small dips and rises that prevented a continuous seal. Air always found a way in. Small currents of cold air would slip beneath the edge, entering the space between the outer covering and the inner lining. But instead of flowing directly into the living space as a cold draft across the floor, the air was intercepted by the inner lining. The lining acted as a baffle, a wall that redirected the flow. The design was deliberate. The bottom edge of the liner rested on the ground or very close to it, but it was positioned inward from the outer covering by those crucial several inches. Cold air entering beneath the outer covering found itself in a narrow channel, with the outer wall on one side and the inner liner on the other. The cold air, once inside this gap, had only one place to go, upward. It moved up through the channel between the liner and the outer wall, guided by the structure itself. The channel was narrow enough that the airflow was controlled, not chaotic. It moved in smooth layers rather than in turbulent swirls. As it rose, it was tempered by contact with the inner lining. The liner, warmed by the fire and the people inside, created an insulating carrier. By the time the rising air reached the top of the lining, it was no longer as cold as it had been when it entered. As this air rose, it fed the fire. Fire needs oxygen to burn. It consumes the air around it, breaking down the oxygen molecules and combining them with carbon from the fuel to create heat, light, carbon dioxide, and water vapour. As the fire consumes oxygen, it creates a draw, a subtle suction that pulls fresh air toward itself. The channel created by the inner lining directed this fresh air upward, delivering it to the fire from all sides. The fire was surrounded by a continuous supply of oxygen, fed by the very structure of the dwelling. The physics at work here are simple. The fire creates heat. The heat makes the air above it less dense, causing it to rise. As hot air exits through the smoke hole at the top, it creates a slight vacuum, a drop in pressure inside the teepee. Nature fills this vacuum by drawing in air from wherever it can enter. The outer covering, being somewhat permeable at the base, allows cold air to seep in. This cold air is then channeled upward through the gap between the liner and the outer wall. As it rises, it is tempered and delivered to the fire. The fire burns this oxygen-rich air, creating more heat and smoke. The hot smoke rises and exits through the top. The cycle continues self-sustaining as long as there is fuel and a temperature difference between inside and outside. The fire burned cleanly because it had a steady supply of oxygen. A fire starved of oxygen smoulders and produces thick smoke. The fuel cannot burn completely. Carbon and other particles are released as smoke rather than being consumed. A fire with too much oxygen burns too hot and consumes fuel quickly, but produces less smoke. But a fire with a balanced, steady supply burns efficiently. The temperature is high enough for complete combustion, but not so high that fuel is wasted. The smoke rose in a clean column because the combustion was thorough. Most of the fuel was converted to heat and gas, and very little was left as unburnt particles. The result was a fire that produced minimal smoke and maximal warmth, and the living space inside the liner remained a calm, protected pocket. The people sitting on the floor on beds of furs and woven blankets did not feel the cold drafts. The rising air moved through the channel, not across the living space. They were bathed in the radiant heat of the fire, surrounded by air that was warm and clear. The inner lining created a room within a room, a sheltered zone where the temperature was stable and comfortable. The liner also prevented the movement of air from creating drafts at ankle level, where they would be most uncomfortable. The air inside the living space was still, or nearly so. You could light a candle and the flame would burn straight up, barely flickering. This was a convection loop, but one that was carefully managed and directed. Cold air entered at the bottom, rose through the channel, fed the fire, and the heated air and smoke rose together out through the smoke hole. It was a continuous self-sustaining cycle. As long as there was a temperature difference between inside and outside, as long as the fire was burning, the system kept moving. No pumps, no fans, no mechanical parts, just air, heat and carefully designed pathways. The system was passive in the sense that it required no external energy, but it was active in that it required intelligent design and constant minor adjustments to maintain optimal function. The beauty of this design was that it used the very thing that created the problem to solve it. The wind, which brought the cold and made life on the plains harsh, was harnessed as the engine of ventilation. The fire, which produced the dangerous smoke, also created the draw that pulled fresh air into the dwelling. Nothing was wasted. Every force was balanced against another. The cold air was tempered before entering the living space. The smoke was pulled out by wind-created low pressure. Living in a tipi required an understanding of this balance. You learned to read the wind. You felt which direction it was coming from by stepping outside and turning your face, noticing where the cold touched first, where the air moved fastest. You could tell the direction of the wind by watching the grass, by seeing which way the smoke from other fires bent, by listening to the sound it made as it moved over the landscape. You watched the smoke as it rose from your own fire. If it drifted or swirled, if it hesitated or descended, you adjusted the flaps. The adjustment was often small, a matter of pushing one pole forward by a foot or pulling another back by the same amount. But these small movements made significant differences in how the smoke behaved. If the fire burned sluggishly, if the flames were weak and yellow, instead of strong and bright, You checked to make sure the bottom edge of the tipi covering was not sealed too tightly, choking off the supply of fresh air. You might lift the edge slightly, propping it with a stick to allow more air to enter the channel. Or you might adjust how the hides overlapped, creating a deliberate gap where air could flow more freely. In very cold weather, when you wanted to minimize heat loss, you would seal the bottom more completely and rely on the adjustable smoke flaps to control ventilation. In milder weather, you might leave the bottom looser, allowing more air circulation and more rapid clearing of any smoke that did enter the living space. The inner lining itself could be adjusted. In the coldest part of winter, it might be pulled tighter, reducing the size of the air channel and slowing the flow of cold air into the dwelling. In spring or fall, when the weather was less severe, it might be loosened, allowing more ventilation. Some groups used different liners for different seasons, a heavier liner for winter and a lighter one for summer. The liner could also be decorated, painted with geometric designs or pictographs that told stories or marked the identity of the family. But these decorations were secondary to the liner's primary function, managing the flow of air. This was not automatic. It was not a dwelling you could simply build and then ignore. It was a living system, and it required participation. But the effort was small and the reward was great. The knowledge became intuitive over time. You did not think consciously about adjusting the flaps or checking the bottom seal. You simply did it, responding to subtle cues without deliberate thought. A well-managed teepee was warm, dry, and remarkably free of smoke. The air inside was clean, with just a faint, pleasant scent from the fire. The fire was steady, burning with a quiet intensity, and the family could gather in comfort, even as the wind howled across the plains outside, even as the temperature dropped far below freezing, even as snow piled against the outer covering. Inside there was warmth. Inside there was light. Inside there was home, the channel system. The inner lining of the teepee served another purpose beyond directing airflow. It acted as a thermal barrier, an insulating layer that helped to keep the precious warmth inside where it was needed. The space between the liner and the outer covering created a layer of trapped air, and air, even cold air, is a poor conductor of heat. This pocket of air, held between two layers of hide, slowed the transfer of warmth from inside to outside. It created a buffer zone, a region where heat had to pass through slowly, rather than escaping directly through the wall. The principle is similar to how modern double-pane windows work, or how a down jacket keeps you warm. The trapped air provides insulation. Heat moving from the warm interior must first warm the inner lining, then warm the air in the channel, then warm the outer covering before it can escape to the outside. Each of these steps takes time and energy. The result is that heat is retained in the living space longer. The fire does not have to burn as hot or consume as much fuel to maintain comfortable temperatures. In winter, this insulation was critical. The temperature on the plains could drop far below freezing. Nights of 20 or 30 degrees below zero were not uncommon in the depths of winter. The wind made it feel even colder, the chill factor dropping temperatures to dangerous levels. But inside a well-constructed teepee, with the fire burning and the liner properly positioned, the interior could remain comfortably warm. People removed their heavy outer robes. They sat in lighter clothing, close to the fire but not pressed against it. Children played on the floor, their breath not visible in the air. It was a space of refuge, a pocket of warmth carved out of the frozen world. The installation of the liner was done with care. It was suspended from the tippy poles using short lengths of cord or strips of rawhide. The attachment points were typically at shoulder height or slightly higher, allowing the liner to hang down and create the necessary gap at the bottom. The liner was not pulled tight against the poles. It hung loosely, creating gentle folds and curves. This loose hanging was important because it allowed air to move through the channel without restriction. If the liner had been pulled tight, it would have pressed against the outer covering in places, blocking the airflow and creating cold spots. The bottom edge of the liner rested on the ground or was tucked slightly under the edge of the sleeping robes and floor coverings. This prevented cold air from spilling directly from the channel into the living space. The air had to rise through the entire height of the channel before it reached the top of the liner, where it would then be drawn toward the fire. This ensured that all incoming air had been tempered by the time it entered the breathing zone of the occupants. The floor itself was often covered with layers of materials, each chosen for specific properties. The first layer, directly on the ground, might be dried grasses or aromatic plants. These provided a pleasant scent and had some insulating value, but their primary purpose was to create a barrier between the cold earth and the people above. Above this first layer came buffalo hides, the primary flooring material. These were laid fur side up to create a soft surface. The fur trapped air, adding to the insulating effect. A good hide, properly tanned and maintained, was soft, warm and durable. The number of hides used depended on the size of the tipi and the wealth of the family. A prosperous household might have the entire floor covered in overlapping hides. A poorer family might have hides only in the sleeping areas, with bare ground or grass mats in the less used spaces. In some cases, additional layers of dried grasses were spread beneath the hides, adding cushioning and insulation. The grass compressed over to time, but could be refreshed by adding new material. Willow mats were also used, carefully crafted rectangles woven from flexible willow shoots. These mats were portable, could be rolled up and transported, and provided a firm, clean surface. They were particularly useful in the area around the fire, where they protected the hides from sparks and made sweeping it easier. The sleeping areas were typically arranged around the perimeter of the tipi, taking advantage of the warmth provided by the liner. Each person or couple had a designated space marked not by walls but by arrangement. Furs and blankets were piled in these areas during the day, creating soft backrests for the sitting. At night they were spread out to create beds. The arrangement was organic, evolving to fit the needs of the family. As children grew, spaces were reallocated. When visitors came, spaces compressed to make room. The sleeping areas were often raised slightly on platforms made from stacked firs or woven willow frames. The elevation was not great, perhaps 6 inches to a foot, but it made a significant difference. Heat rises, and the air closest to the ground is always the coldest. Cold air is denser, and it sinks, pooling at the lowest level. By sleeping a foot or so above the floor, people stayed warmer through the night. They were lifted into the zone where the air was warmest and most comfortable. The platforms also kept sleepers away from any moisture that might accumulate on the ground, from condensation or from snow tracked in on feet and clothing. Storage was arranged along the walls as well, creating a ring of belongings around the interior. Parfleches, which were folded rawhide containers, were the primary storage vessels. These were made by taking a single piece of rawhide and folding it into an envelope shape, then lashing it closed. The rawhide, when dry, was rigid and held its shape. When filled, a parfleche could hold dried meat, pemmican, tools, clothing, or other small items. They were often painted with geometric designs in earth colours, creating beautiful patterns that also served to identify the owner. Parfleches were stacked against the walls between the inner liner and the sleeping areas. They created an additional layer of insulation, a barrier of stored goods that helped to keep the cold from seeping through. Larger items like additional furs, extra tipi poles, or bundles of dried food were also stored here. The arrangement was efficient. Everything had a place and the space was used fully without feeling cramped. The storage along the walls also helped to deaden sound, absorbing echoes and creating a quieter interior. Personal items were kept within easy reach of each person's sleeping area. A man's weapons were typically given a place of honour. His bow might hang from a pole near his sleeping space, the string loosened to preserve it when not in use. His quiver of arrows would be hung nearby, the arrows carefully arranged so the fletching was not crushed. His knife, his most essential tool, might be kept in a decorated sheath attached to his belt even while sleeping or placed within arm's reach. These weapons were not just practical tools, they were sacred items treated with respect and care. A woman's tools for working hides were similarly organised. Scrapers, made from bone, or later from metal obtained through trade, were kept in a leather pouch. Awls for punching holes, made from bone or antler, were stored carefully to keep their points sharp. Needles, precious items that required skill to make, were kept in a special case, often decorated and treasured. Sinew for thread was stored in small bundles, kept dry so it would remain strong and flexible. These tools represented expertise, the ability to transform raw hides into clothing, shelter and containers. They were essential to survival and were treated accordingly. Clothing not currently being worn was folded and stored in parfleches or draped over horizontal poles strung between the main supports. In a large teepee there might be several of these horizontal poles at different heights, creating multiple levels of storage. The clothing was kept off the ground, away from moisture and pests. In winter, extra layers were kept, close at hand, ready to be put on if someone needed to step outside. In summer, lighter clothing was more accessible, with heavier items packed away. The organisation of the interior space reflected the social structure of the family. Each person knew their place, their storage area, their responsibilities. Children learned from an early age where things belonged and how to maintain order. The circular arrangement meant that everyone faced the centre, where the fire burned. This central focus reinforced the communal nature of the space. You were always aware of others, always part of the group. The fire itself was small. It did not need to be large. A fire the size of a modern campfire would have been excessive, wasteful, and uncomfortable in such a confined space. Instead, the hearth was a shallow pit, perhaps a foot across and a few inches deep, lined with carefully selected stones. The pit was positioned at the exact centre of the teepee, equidistant from all points on the perimeter. This centering was not approximate. It was precise, measured, important to the balance of the whole system. The stones lining the hearth were chosen with the same care given to every other aspect of the teepee. They needed to be dense, non-porous, and able to withstand repeated heating and cooling without cracking. River stones were generally avoided because they often contained moisture that could turn to steam and cause them to explode. Instead, stones from dry hillsides or exposed outcrops were preferred. These stones absorbed heat during the day and radiated it back at night, extending the warmth of the fire beyond the time when flames were visible. The flames rarely rose more than a few inches above the fuel. This small fire produced enough heat to warm the space, and it consumed only a modest amount of fuel. The efficiency was remarkable. A family could stay warm all day and through the night on a handful of buffalo chips and a few pieces of wood. The small size of the fire also meant that it produced less smoke, making the ventilation system's job easier. A large roaring fire would have overwhelmed the smoke hole and filled the teepee with haze, but this small controlled fire produced a thin column of smoke that rose cleanly and left without lingering. Fuel on the plains was a constant concern, one that shaped daily routines and seasonal planning. Trees were scarce, the cottonwoods that grew along rivers and streams were valuable, but they were not always nearby. When the camp was near a river, wood gathering became a priority. Dead branches were collected, the best fuel because they were dry. Living trees were rarely cut unless absolutely necessary because they were too valuable as landmarks and sources of future fuel. Driftwood could be collected from riverbanks, washed down from the mountains during spring floods, but it was limited and unpredictable. Finding a cache of driftwood was a stroke of luck, and it would be carefully gathered and distributed among families. Instead, the primary fuel for most of the year was dried buffalo dung. This material, once dried in the sun, became hard and light. It was found everywhere the buffalo had been, which on the plains meant almost everywhere. The great herds moved in vast numbers, and they left behind a supply of fuel that seemed inexhaustible. A person could walk for an hour and gather enough buffalo chips to keep a fire burning for several days. The material was light enough that even children could carry significant amounts. Gathering buffalo chips was a regular task, one that was often assigned to children or done by women while the camp was being set up after a move. It was not difficult work, but it required time and attention. The dried chips were scattered across the landscape and you walked slowly, scanning the ground, picking up each piece and adding it to a basket or bag. The best chips were those that had been drying for weeks or months, thoroughly dried by sun and wind. Fresh dung was avoided because it was still moist and would not burn well. The collected chips were stored in piles near the teepee, usually on the upwind side so that prevailing winds would not blow debris from the pile into the dwelling. The pile was often covered with an old hide or a piece of canvas to keep the chips dry. Rain or snow could soak the supply, rendering it useless. Wet buffalo chips smoulder and smoke heavily, producing little heat and much discomfort. This was why storage and preparation mattered. You had to think ahead, to anticipate the weather, to make sure your supply was protected. When buffalo chips burned, they smouldered rather than flaming. The fire was low and steady, producing consistent heat. The smoke from burning dung was minimal and had a faintly sweet, grassy smell. It was not unpleasant. In fact, many people found it quite agreeable, a scent that became associated with home and warmth. In the well-ventilated space of the teepee, this smoke was barely noticeable. It rose in a thin, almost invisible column and exited cleanly through the top. You could sit inside for hours, tending the fire, cooking, working, without your eyes watering or your throat tightening. In those days, the daily rhythm revolved around the fire. In the morning, it was revived from the embers that had been banked the night before. The ash covering was carefully brushed aside, revealing coals that still glowed faintly orange. A small amount of dry grass or shredded bark was added, and someone would blow on the coals, coaxing the flames back to life. The grass would catch first, producing small quick flames. Then buffalo chips were added one at a time, placed carefully on top of the burning grass. The chips would catch from the flames below, and within minutes the fire would be burning steadily again. Throughout the day, chips were added as needed. The fire was never allowed to grow large. It was kept at a steady level, just enough to provide warmth and light. Too much. Fuel would create too much heat, making the interior uncomfortable. Too little, and the warmth would fade. At night, before the family went to sleep, the fire was banked. The burning embers were covered with a layer of ash, which starved them of oxygen without extinguishing them completely. They would smoulder through the night, just barely alive. In the morning, the process would begin again. This continuity was important. It meant that fire did not have to be restarted from scratch each day. The thread of warmth was never broken. The fire was kept alive, passed from day to day, carried through the seasons like a living thing that required care and feeding. The multiple sources. In the forests of the northeast, the landscape was entirely different. Here the trees grew thick and tall, elm, hickory, oak, maple, beech. The canopy overhead was dense, and in summer, the forest floor was shaded and cool, carpeted with layers of fallen leaves. In winter, snow gathered on the branches and fell in heavy blankets, muffling sound and turning the world into a study in black and white. The wind did not sweep across the land as it did on the plains. It moved through the trees, broken and softened, filtered into gusts and whispers. The Haudenosaunee, sometimes called the Iroquois, lived in this forested world. They were not nomadic. They did not follow herds. Instead, they built permanent villages. These villages were fortified with palisades, tall wooden walls made from sharpened logs driven into the ground and lashed together. The walls enclosed several acres, creating a defensible space large enough to hold multiple longhouses, storage structures, and open areas for communal activities. Inside the walls were the longhouses, the distinctive structures that gave the Haudenosaunee their architectural identity. A longhouse was built from a framework of saplings, young trees that were flexible enough to be bent and lashed together to form a long, vaulted tunnel. The frame was then covered with large sheets of bark overlapping like shingles on a roof. Elm bark was preferred when available. It could be peeled from the tree in large sections, sometimes 6 or 8 feet long and several feet wide. It was relatively waterproof, durable, and easy to work with. The structure was long, sometimes stretching more than 100 feet. Some longhouses were even longer, reaching 200 feet or more. The width was usually around 20 feet, sometimes slightly more. The height at the center was tall enough for a person to stand comfortably, perhaps 8 or 10 feet. Inside, the space was divided, but not by walls. There were no separate rooms, no doors, no true privacy in the modern sense. A central corridor ran the length of the building, a walkway perhaps 6 feet wide. On either side of this corridor were the living areas for individual families. Each family had a section of the longhouse, a space marked not by physical barriers but by custom and arrangement. The sections were defined by wooden platforms built along the walls. These platforms served as beds, seats, and storage areas. Above them, more platforms were built, creating a second level for additional storage. The space between the platforms and the outer walls was filled with the belongings of the family. Baskets of corn and beans, dried fish and meat, tools, furs, clothing, all the material necessities of life. Down the centre of the corridor, at regular intervals, were the fire pits. Each pit was shared by 2 families, one on each side. The fire burned in a shallow depression dug into the earth, usually lined with stones. The hearth was simple but effective, but here there were many fires. A large longhouse might have 5 or 6 hearths, each one burning, each one producing smoke. A household of 50 or 60 people, all living under one roof, all needing warmth and light and the ability to cook. This created a new challenge. A single fire, managed carefully, can be ventilated with a single smoke hole. You know where the smoke will rise, and you place an opening directly above. But multiple fires, burning simultaneously along the length of a building, cannot be served by individual holes without creating problems. Too many openings would weaken the roof, creating structural vulnerabilities where water could leak in and where the arched framework might sag or collapse. They would also create chaotic airflow. Smoke from one fire might be pulled toward the opening of another, creating eddies and backflows that would fill the living space with haze. The drafts would be unpredictable, pulling cold air in from multiple directions, making the interior uncomfortable and difficult to heat. The solution was elegant. Instead of individual smoke holes, the roof of the longhouse was built with a long, continuous slot running along the peak. This slot stretched almost the entire length of the building, positioned directly above the line of hearths. It was a single opening, but it served all the fires at once. The slot was not left completely open to the elements. It was covered with movable panels of bark, large pieces that could be propped open with poles or pulled shut with ropes. These panels were the control system, the adjustable interface between the interior and the exterior, the means by which the occupants could manage the ventilation for all the fires simultaneously. The Communal Hall. The longhouse was not a collection of separate homes. It was a single, shared space, a communal dwelling that housed an extended family. The families living inside were related, members of the same clan. Clan identity was strong among the Haudenosaunee. It determined social roles, political alliances, and inheritance. Living together in a longhouse reinforced these bonds. It was a physical manifestation of kinship, a structure that held people together not just literally, but socially and spiritually. The structure of the building reflected this communal arrangement. There were no walls between families, no doors to close, no private rooms where you could retreat from the group. The space was open, and life was lived in view of others. This required cooperation. The management of the fires, the adjustment of the roof panels, the storage of food and materials, all of these were shared responsibilities. You could not live in a longhouse without engaging with the community. You were part of it constantly, inescapably. The fires were tended by the women of each family. They decided when to add wood, when to let the fire die down, when to bank the coals for the night. But these decisions affected everyone. A fire that produced too much smoke would fill not just one family's area, but the entire building. The smoke would drift, spreading through the open interior, affecting everyone who lived there. This was unacceptable. It caused discomfort, and more importantly, it disrupted the social balance. A family that could not manage its fire was failing in its responsibilities to the community. Similarly, if one fire was allowed to go out while others continued to burn, it created an imbalance in the airflow. The smoke from the burning fires would be drawn toward the cold spot where the other fire had been, creating uneven ventilation. Eddies and currents would form, unpredictable and uncomfortable. The system worked best when all the fires were burning at roughly the same intensity, producing similar amounts of smoke and heat. This required coordination, communication, and a shared understanding of how the building functioned. The roof panels were adjusted based on the weather and the wind. If the wind was coming from the west, the panels on the western side of the slot would be closed or partially closed, and the panels on the eastern side would be opened. This created a path for the wind to flow across the roof, pulling the smoke out through the open sections. The principle was the same as in the teepee. Wind moving across an opening creates a drop in pressure that draws smoke upward. But in the longhouse, the coordination was more complex. There were multiple panels, multiple sections of roof, and multiple families whose comfort was affected by each adjustment. Decisions about the panels were made collectively. If one family wanted to open a panel above their fire because they felt the smoke was lingering, they would discuss it with the neighbouring families. If another family felt that opening that panel would create too much draft, pulling cold air in and making their area uncomfortable, they would say so. A compromise would be found. Perhaps the panel would be opened only part way. Perhaps a different panel would be adjusted instead. The process required patience, flexibility, and a willingness to consider the needs of others. It was a constant low-level exercise in governance and cooperation. The high-vaulted ceiling helped. The peak of the roof was well above the heads of the people living, inside rising 10 or 12 feet above the floor. Smoke, as it rose from the fires, gathered in this upper space. It formed a layer, a cloud of grey that hung beneath the roof. As long as this layer remained above the living areas, well above where people sat and worked and slept. It did not cause problems. The people below breathed clear air. The smoke drifted slowly toward the roof slot, where it was drawn out by the wind or by the simple fact that hot air rises and escapes through the highest opening available. The sleeping platforms were elevated. They were built at a height of about 2 or 3 feet off the ground, constructed from wooden planks or woven mats supported by a framework of poles. This kept the sleepers in the warmest layer of air. The coldest air, as always, settled near the floor. The warmest air rose toward the ceiling. The middle layer, where the platforms were positioned, was the most comfortable. It was warm without being stifling, clear without being cold. At night, people wrapped themselves in furs and blankets and slept soundly, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the household. During the day, the platform served as seats. People sat with their backs against the wall, facing the central corridor, watching the activity of the household. Work was done here. Women prepared food, scraping kernels of corn from dried cobs, grinding them into meal, mixing them with water to make bread. They scraped hides, removing every trace of fat and tissue, preparing them for tanning. They wove baskets from splints of ashwood, creating containers for storage and carrying. They sewed clothing from deerskin, using bone needles and thread made from sinew. Men repaired tools, sharpened knives and axes, crafted new arrows, told stories of hunts and councils. Children played on the floor or helped with tasks appropriate to their age, learning by the watching and doing. The longhouse was a hive of activity, a space where life unfolded continuously. At night, the platforms became beds. Furs and woven mats were spread out, creating soft sleeping surfaces. Families slept together, close for warmth and comfort. The fires were banked, but not extinguished. The embers glowed through the night, providing a dim light and steady heat. The longhouse was never truly dark. Even at midnight, even in the deepest part of winter, the coals gave off a faint glow, enough to see shapes and movement, enough to navigate if you needed to get up in the night. The slot of liberation. The roof slot was not a single opening. It was a series of openings, each one covered by a movable panel. These panels were large, often several feet long and 2 or 3 feet wide. They were made from sheets of bark, the same material that covered the rest of the roof. The bark was lashed to a frame of the thin branches or saplings, creating a rigid but lightweight structure. The frame gave the bark stability, preventing it from warping or tearing in the wind. The construction of these panels required skill and patience. The frame was built first, with branches selected for straightness and flexibility. They were lashed together at the corners with strips of inner bark or rawhide, creating a rectangular grid. The bark sheets were then attached to this frame, overlapping slightly to prevent water from seeping through. The attachment was done with more strips of bark fibre, woven through holes punched in the bark sheet and tied to the frame. The result was a panel that was both strong and light, easily lifted by one person, but sturdy enough to withstand wind and weather. The panels were held in place by a system of ropes and poles. Ropes ran from the edges of each panel down through the roof and into the interior of the longhouse. These ropes were made from twisted plant fibres, strong and rot-resistant. The ropes were long enough to reach from the roof peak down to the floor, where they were tied to points inside, usually to one of the main structural poles or to a stake driven into the ground near the central corridor. By pulling on these ropes, someone inside could lift the panel, propping it open at an angle. The motion was simple but required understanding of leverage and tension. If you pulled too hard, the rope might snap. If you pulled unevenly, the panel would twist and bind against its neighbours. The technique was learned through practice, typically taught by elders to younger family members. A child would watch their mother or grandmother adjust the panels, noting how much force was needed, how the angle of pull affected the result, how to secure the rope once the desired position was achieved. The angle of the panel could be adjusted to control how much of the slot was exposed. A fully open panel was propped nearly vertical, creating a wide gap for smoke to escape. This position was used when all the fires were burning strongly, when there was much cooking being done, or when the weather was calm and there was no wind to assist with ventilation. A partially open panel was angled at perhaps 45 degrees, creating a smaller gap. This position was useful when the fire was low, when only 1 or 2 families were cooking, or when the wind was strong and you did not want to lose too much heat through excessive ventilation. Poles were also used to prop the panels open from below. These were long poles, perhaps 10 or 12 feet in length, kept leaning against the interior wall when not in use. When a panel needed to be propped open, someone would take one of these poles and insert the end through the gap in the roof, wedging it against the underside of the panel. The other end of the pole rested on the floor or against one of the sleeping platforms. The angle of the pole determined how far open the panel would be held. A steep angle created a small opening. A shallow angle pushed the panel higher, creating a larger opening. This method of adjustment allowed for fine control. If you wanted just a small opening, perhaps to let out a trickle of smoke on a very cold day. When you wanted to minimize heat loss, you could prop the panel open just a few inches. If you wanted a larger opening, perhaps in the morning when fires were being built up and smoke was more abundant, you could push the panel higher. The system was flexible, responsive, and entirely mechanical. There were no hinges, no complex fasteners, just simple leverage and gravity doing the work. The occupants learned to read the smoke with precision. Smoke inside the longhouse behaved differently than smoke in the open air. It rose from the fires, as always, but it also interacted with the air currents inside the building, with the breath of the people, with the moisture from cooking pots and drying clothes. If the smoke was rising cleanly, moving in steady streams from each fire directly upward toward the roof slot, the ventilation was working well. The panels were left as they were, and no adjustment was needed. But smoke did not always cooperate. Meanwhile, on certain days, it would rise partway and then hesitate, spreading out beneath the roof rather than continuing upward and out. This happened when the air pressure inside and outside the building was nearly equal, when there was no driving force to push the smoke out. In these conditions, the smoke would accumulate, forming a thick layer in the upper reaches of the longhouse. The layer would descend as more smoke was added, eventually reaching the level where people lived and worked. When this happened, adjustments were made immediately. Someone would notice the smoke descending, would see the haze forming, would feel the irritation in their eyes or throat. They would stand, walk to the nearest rope and pull. The panel above would lift, creating more opening for the smoke to escape. Often this was enough. The increased opening would allow the accumulated smoke to flow out, and within minutes the air would clear. But sometimes more was needed. Sometimes multiple panels had to be adjusted, or panels at both ends of the building had to be opened to create a cross-draft. Over time, people learned which panel adjustments worked best for different wind directions. The wind direction was critical to the management of the panels. On a calm day with no wind to create pressure differences, the smoke rose slowly and the ventilation was sluggish. The air inside the longhouse was heavy, still, and the smoke gathered in the upper reaches, reluctant to leave. On these days, more of the roof slot had to be opened to allow the smoke to escape through simple buoyancy, the natural tendency of hot air to rise. You would open panels along the entire length of the slot, creating a continuous opening from one end of the building to the other. This maximised the exit area for the smoke and allowed even the slowest moving smoke to find its way out. On a windy day, everything changed. The wind moving across the roof created zones of low pressure, spots where the air was being pulled upward by the passing wind. This low pressure acted like a vacuum, drawing smoke out of the building with surprising force. On these days, the smoke was drawn out quickly and efficiently. Less of the slot needed to be open. In fact, opening too much could create problems. Too much opening meant too much heat loss. Cold air would be pulled into the building to replace the warm air being drawn out. The interior would cool rapidly, and the fires would have to burn hotter to compensate, consuming more wood. The direction of the wind determined which panels should be opened. If the wind was coming from the west, blowing across the longhouse from that direction, the panels on the eastern side of the slot would be opened. The wind would flow over the roof, creating low pressure on the eastern side, and this low pressure would pull the smoke out through the opened panels. The panels on the western side would be kept closed or only slightly open, preventing the wind from blowing directly down into the building. People learned by watching the smoke, by noticing what happened when they opened certain panels in certain conditions. They learned that opening a panel on the windward side was usually counterproductive, allowing wind to blow down into the building and scattering the smoke. They learned that opening panels on the leeward side created the best draw, pulling smoke out smoothly and steadily. Rain and snow added another layer of complexity to the management of the roof slot. Water falling through an open panel would land directly on the fires below, creating problems that ranged from inconvenient to serious. A small amount of water on a fire would cause it to hiss and spit, sending up clouds of steam and ash. A large amount could extinguish the fire entirely, leaving a family cold and without the ability to cook. Snow was even more challenging because it fell in greater volume and accumulated on the edges of the opening, potentially blocking the smoke flow. The panels were positioned to act as a canopy, angled to deflect rain and snow while still allowing smoke to escape. This required careful balance and constant adjustment throughout a storm. The angle had to be steep enough to shed water, but not so steep that it closed the opening entirely. In practice, this meant that during heavy rain, the panels were opened only partially, creating a narrow gap that was protected by the overhanging bark. The smoke had to find its way out through this narrow gap, and sometimes it did not succeed entirely. Some smoke would linger inside during heavy storms, and this was accepted as unavoidable. The priority was keeping the fires lit and the interior dry. Snow presented a different challenge. In a heavy snowfall, snow would accumulate on top of the panels, weighing them down. If too much snow accumulated, it could cause a panel to collapse inward, dumping snow onto the people below. To prevent this, someone had to periodically climb up to the roof and clear the snow from the panels. This was done using a long pole with a scraper attached, pushing the snow off the edges. It was cold, unpleasant work, but necessary. The person doing it would be careful to avoid standing directly over the smoke hole, where the hot smoke rising from below could create a sudden updraft that might cause them to lose their balance. The Haudenosaunee developed a deep understanding of this balance between ventilation and weather protection through generations of experience. A child growing up in a longhouse watched as the adults adjusted the panels. They learned when to pull the ropes, when to prop the poles, when to leave things alone. They observed the smoke, noting how it behaved in different weather, at different times of day, with different amounts of fuel on the fire. They learned the subtle signs that indicated adjustment was needed. A slight heaviness in the air, a faint sting in the eyes, a dimming of the light from the fires as smoke began to obscure them. These signs were noticed early, before the smoke became a serious problem, and action was taken immediately. The adjustment might be small, opening a single panel by a few more inches, but it would be enough to restore balance. The smoke would clear, the air would lighten, and life would continue without interruption. By the time they were adults, this knowledge was instinctive. They could glance at the smoke and know immediately what needed to be done. They could feel the wind direction, without consciously thinking about it. They could hear the sound of rain beginning, and know which panels to adjust before the water started falling inside. The management of the roof slot became as natural as breathing, a skill so deeply ingrained that it required no conscious thought. The cooperation required to manage the longhouse ventilation was part of the social fabric of the community. It was woven into daily life, as fundamental as cooking or sleeping. Decisions about the panels were made collectively, through discussion and consensus. If one family wanted to open a panel above their fire, because they felt the smoke was lingering, they would mention it to the neighbouring families. If another family felt that opening that panel would create too much draft in their area, pulling cold air in and making them uncomfortable, they would say so. A conversation would follow. Perhaps the first family would explain that they were preparing a large meal and the fire would be burning hot for the next hour. The neighbouring family might acknowledge this and agree to the adjustment, asking only that the panel be closed again once the cooking was done. Or perhaps a compromise would be suggested. Open the panel halfway rather than fully, providing some relief without creating excessive draft. These negotiations happened constantly, dozens of times a day, usually brief and amicable. This constant low-level cooperation reinforced the bonds between families. It taught patience, the ability to wait for what you needed. It taught flexibility, the willingness to adapt your preferences to accommodate others. It taught the importance of considering the collective good over individual comfort. You could not live in a longhouse without engaging with these principles. The smoke, the fires, the roof panels, all of it required a communal approach. You could not manage your fire without thinking about how it affected others. You could not adjust a roof panel without considering the families on either side. The building itself taught you how to live together. It was a physical structure that embodied social values. The openness of the interior meant that you could not hide your actions from others. The shared fires meant that you were dependent on your neighbours and they on you. The collective management of ventilation meant that you had to communicate, to cooperate, to find consensus. These were not abstract lessons taught through stories or sermons. They were lived experiences encountered every day in the most basic acts of maintaining comfort and safety. The fires themselves were carefully managed to support this collective system. Hardwood was preferred for its long-burning qualities and its production of minimal smoke. Oak, hickory, maple, ash. These woods burned slowly and produced a bed of hot coals. The coals were what provided the steady, lasting heat that warmed the space through the long winter nights. The flames were useful for cooking, for providing light, but the coals were what sustained warmth over time. Each family had a supply of wood stacked near their living area, arranged neatly against the wall, or stored on an upper platform where it would stay dry. This wood had been gathered during the warmer months, a task that required significant communal labour. Trees were felled in the forest, the trunks were cut into manageable sections, and these sections were split into pieces that could be easily handled. The wood was then carried back to the village and stacked in open areas where air could circulate, allowing it to dry throughout the summer and fall. Dry wood burns hotter and cleaner than green wood. It produces less smoke because more of the fuel is consumed in the combustion process. Wet or green wood smoulders, releasing thick smoke and creosote. The preparation of firewood was therefore one of the major tasks of the year, requiring planning, labour, and coordination among multiple families. A single longhouse might consume several cords of wood over the course of a winter. Ensuring an adequate supply required that the community worked together, that labour was shared, and that the harvest was distributed fairly among families. The wood gathering sites were known and returned to year after year. Certain groves were designated for harvest, while others were left untouched to mature. This management of the forest resource required long-term thinking and communal discipline. No single family could take more than their share. No one could harvest from protected groves. The rules were enforced through social pressure and, when necessary, through the decisions of the clan mothers who governed the community. The wood that burned in the longhouse fires represented not just fuel, but the collective labour and wisdom of the entire village. The breathing roof. The interaction between the multiple fires and the roof slot created a shared atmosphere inside the longhouse. The smoke from one fire did not rise in isolation, in a clean separate column that moved directly to the opening above. It mingled with the smoke from the other fires. The columns of smoke rising from each hearth merged in the upper reaches of the building. Together, they formed a collective cloud that gathered beneath the roof, spreading along the length of the slot, seeking exit wherever the panels were open. This mingling required the fires to be managed in harmony. If one fire was allowed to burn too hot, producing a large volume of smoke, it could overwhelm the ventilation system. The smoke from that fire would spill over, descending into the living areas of other families. This was more than an inconvenience. It was a violation of the shared space, a failure of responsibility. It caused discomfort, stinging eyes and irritated throats, and more importantly, it disrupted the social balance. The family responsible would be expected to correct the problem immediately, damping down their fire, adjusting their panels, doing whatever was necessary to restore equilibrium. Similarly, if one fire was allowed to go out while others continued to burn, it created an imbalance in the airflow. The smoke from the burning fires would be drawn toward the cold spot where the other fire had been, pulled by the change in temperature and pressure. This created uneven ventilation. Some areas of the longhouse would have clear air, while others would fill with smoke. Drafts would form, cold air rushing in to replace the heat that was missing. The system worked best when all the fires were burning at roughly the same intensity, producing similar amounts of smoke and heat, contributing equally to the overall atmosphere of the building. This collective management was part of daily life. It was not something that required constant, focused attention, but it was always present in the background. People developed an awareness of the atmosphere inside the longhouse. They noticed when the air began to feel heavy, when the smoke started to drift lower, when the light from the fires seemed dimmer because of haze in the air. They responded with small adjustments, adding wood to a fire that had burned down, shifting a roof panel to improve the draw, opening a door flap slightly to allow more fresh air to enter from the ends of the building. The doors at the ends of the longhouse also played a role in ventilation. These were not solid wooden doors with hinges and latches. They were coverings made from hides or woven mats, hung over the openings at each end of the building. In winter, they were kept closed to retain heat, held in place by tying them to posts or weighting them with stones at the bottom. They could be pulled aside to allow air to flow through. A draft running the length of the longhouse, entering through one door and exiting through the other, could help clear smoke on days when the roof panels were not providing enough ventilation on their own. This cross-ventilation was used sparingly, because it also pulled heat out of the building, but it was a tool available when needed. The interior of the longhouse was dim. Light came from the fires and from whatever sunlight filtered through the gaps in the bark walls and the openings in the roof. There were no windows in the modern sense, no glass panes to let in light while keeping out cold. The bark covering was thick enough to block most light, and cutting large openings would have weakened the structure and let in cold and rain. The dim light created a quiet, enclosed feeling. It was a space turned inward, focused on the warmth and activity within rather than the world outside. In this dim, warm space, people spent the long winter months. They cooked, ate, worked and slept. They told stories, passing down the history of the people, the creation stories, the tales of ancestors and heroes. They made plans for the spring for planting and hunting and trading. They repaired tools and clothing, maintaining the material infrastructure of their lives. They cared for children, teaching them the skills they would need, the knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. Life continued, insulated from the harshness of the season. The longhouse was not just a shelter, it was a social structure made physical. The architecture reinforced the values of the community: cooperation, shared responsibility, collective well-being. These were not abstract ideals discussed in councils and then forgotten. They were built into the very design of the building. You could not live in a longhouse without engaging with these principles. The smoke, the fires, the roof panels, all of it required a communal approach. You could not manage your fire without considering how it affected others. You could not adjust a roof panel without thinking about the families on either side. The building taught you how to live together, the earth's stillness. West of the forested lands, in the river valleys that cut through the high plains, another group of people built their homes. The Mandan, the Hidatsa and the Arikara lived along the Missouri River and its tributaries. The land here was open, much like the Great Plains, but the rivers provided something the plains did not: stable, fertile soil and access to large timber. The river valleys were sheltered, protected from the worst of the wind by the high banks and the trees that grew along the water. These people were farmers as well as hunters. They grew corn, beans and squash in gardens near their villages. The crops were planted in the spring, tended through the summer and harvested in the fall. The harvest was stored in underground pits, cache pits dug into the earth and lined with grass, where the food would stay cool and dry through the winter. They hunted buffalo, going out onto the plains in organised groups, but they did not follow the herds year-round. They stayed in one place, returning to their villages after the hunt, and because of this they built homes designed to last. The earth lodge was their answer to winter. It was a large, circular, dome-shaped structure, partially buried in the ground. The construction began with excavation. A circular pit was dug, usually about 3 or 4 feet deep and 40 to 60 feet in diameter. The work was communal, with multiple families contributing labour. The earth removed from the pit was piled nearby in neat mounds. It would be used later, placed back on top of the structure once the framework was complete. Inside the pit, a framework of massive wooden posts was erected. 4 large central posts, often a foot or more in diameter, were set in a square at the centre of the space. These posts were the primary supports. They were sunk deep into the ground, anchored firmly, and they had to be strong enough to bear the weight of the entire roof. From the tops of these 4 posts, heavy beams were laid, connecting them in a square frame. This central square was the heart of the structure, the core from which everything else radiated. From this central frame, smaller posts and rafters extended outward to the edge of the pit. These secondary supports were thinner, but still substantial, perhaps 6 inches in diameter. They were set at regular intervals, creating a ring around the central square. More beams connected these outer posts, and from them rafters extended inward and upward to the central frame, creating the skeleton of the dome. The structure resembled the frame of an enormous basket turned upside down, a geometric lattice of wood that defined the shape of the dwelling. Once the framework was complete, it was covered. First, smaller branches and willow mats were laid across the rafters, creating a lattice that would hold the next layers. Then layers of dried grass and reeds were added, packed tightly to create a thick, insulating layer. Finally, the earth that had been excavated was piled on top. The walls were covered first, then the roof, layer upon layer, until the entire structure was buried beneath a mound of earth. The earth was compacted by hand and by foot, pressed down to remove air pockets and create a solid mass. The walls became thick, often 2 feet or more of compacted soil, sod and clay. The roof was similarly covered, layer upon layer, until the dwelling was almost completely hidden beneath the earth. From the outside, an earth lodge looked like a hill. In winter, it was covered with snow and it became almost invisible, blending into the landscape. The only signs of habitation were the smoke rising from the opening at the top and the entrance tunnel that led inside. But inside it was a large, warm and surprisingly comfortable space. The hill that shelters. The principle behind the earth lodge was insulation. Earth, when compacted and dry, is a poor conductor of heat. It does not transfer warmth quickly from one place to another. This property makes earth an excellent insulator. The temperature deep within the ground remains relatively stable throughout the year. In winter, the ground below the frost line, below the depth at which freezing temperatures penetrate, stays warmer than the air above. It might be 30 or 40 degrees, while the air temperature is far below zero. In summer, the ground stays cooler than the scorching air. This stability, this resistance to change, is what made earth such an effective building material. By building a structure that was partially underground and entirely covered in earth, the Mandan and their neighbours were able to borrow this stability. The thick earthen walls acted as a thermal barrier. The cold winter wind, no matter how fierce, could not penetrate. The wind could blow at 30 or 40 miles per hour, driving snow and sleet, and inside the earth lodge you would not feel it. The temperature inside remained stable, insulated by the mass of earth that surrounded and covered the structure. The heat generated by the fire inside was held within the space. It did not escape quickly through the walls as it would in a thinner structure. Instead, it was absorbed by the earth, stored in the mass of soil and clay. The walls themselves became warm, and they radiated this warmth back into the interior. The earth lodge was not just a shelter from the wind, it was a heat sink, a thermal battery that absorbed warmth during the day and released it at night. The fire was placed in the centre of the earth lodge, in a circular hearth. The hearth was large, often 5 or 6 feet in diameter, and it was lined with carefully selected stones. The stones were chosen for their ability to withstand heat without cracking or exploding. River stones, which often contain moisture, were avoided. Instead, people used dense, dry stones from the surrounding bluffs, stones that had been exposed to sun and wind for years. These stones would absorb heat from the fire and radiate it back into the space just as the walls did. Above the hearth, at the very apex of the dome, was a single smoke hole. This hole was the only opening in the roof. It was usually about 3 or 4 feet in diameter, and it was the dwelling's only source of ventilation and natural light. During the day, sunlight streamed down through this opening, illuminating the central area around the fire. The light was dim by modern standards, but it was enough to see by, enough to work by. At night, the opening was a portal to the stars, a circle of sky visible from inside the warm, dark space. The simplicity of this system was striking. There were no adjustable flaps, no movable panels, no complex mechanisms, just one hole, positioned directly above the fire. The smoke rose in a clean, undisturbed column and exited through this opening. The system worked because the earth lodge was not fighting the wind. It was ignoring it entirely. The wind could blow as hard as it wanted outside, but inside the air was still. The thick walls blocked not only the cold, but also the movement of air. This stillness was critical. It meant that the smoke rose in a straight, predictable line. There were no drafts to scatter it, no cross breezes to pull it into the living space. It simply rose and left. Fresh air entered the earth lodge through a long, covered passageway. This passageway was the entrance, and it was as important to the ventilation system as the smoke hole itself. It was not just a way to get in and out. It was an engineered component of the dwelling's heating and ventilation system. The cold trap. The entrance to an earth lodge was not a simple door. It was a tunnel, long and narrow, that angled downward from the outside before rising up into the main chamber. This design was deliberate. The tunnel was not merely a passageway. It was an engineered component of the dwelling's heating and ventilation system, as important as the smoke hole above or the thick earthen walls. The tunnel typically extended 15 to 20 feet from the exterior entrance to the point where it opened into the main chamber. The length varied depending on the size of the earth lodge and the depth of the excavation, but it was always substantial. This length was necessary for the system to function properly. A short tunnel would not provide enough distance for the cold air trap to work. A longer tunnel was better, but there were practical limits based on the amount of excavation required and the need to maintain structural integrity. The descent was gradual, not steep. The tunnel sloped downward at perhaps a 15 or 20 degree angle, gentle enough that you could walk down it without difficulty, but steep enough that the descent was noticeable. As you entered from the outside, you would find yourself walking downward into the earth. The walls of the tunnel were packed the same material as the rest of the structure. Sometimes they were lined with wooden planks or woven mats to prevent erosion and to create a more finished surface, but often they were simply bare earth, compacted hard by years of use. The tunnel reached its lowest point roughly at the midway mark. Here there was a deliberate depression, a low spot that was several inches or sometimes a foot lower than the floor level of the main chamber. This depression was the key to the entire system. It was the sump, the cold trap, the place where heavy cold air would collect and be prevented from entering the living space. The physics involved are straightforward. Cold air is denser than warm air because its molecules move more slowly and pack more closely together. This increased density gives cold air greater mass per unit of volume. As a result, cold air is heavier than warm air and will sink to the lowest available point. This is why cold air settles in valleys on calm nights, why frost forms first in low-lying areas, why the coldest spot in a room is always near the floor. The tunnel took advantage of this property. Cold air from outside would enter the tunnel, drawn by the slight negative pressure created by the fire inside the lodge consuming oxygen. As this cold air moved into the tunnel, gravity would pull it downward along the sloping floor. When it reached the lowest point, the depression in the centre of the tunnel, it would pool there. The cold air, being heavy, could not easily rise back up the slope that led to the main chamber. It would sit in the depression, trapped by its own weight, creating a stable pool of cold air that acted as a barrier. Warmer air from the main chamber, being less dense and therefore lighter, would float above this pool of cold air. The boundary between the cold air in the sump and the warm air above it was not sharp or visible, but it was real. You could feel it as you walked through the tunnel. As you descended from the outside, the temperature would drop. At the lowest point it would be coldest. Then, as you climbed the slight rise toward the main chamber, the temperature would increase again. By the time you emerged into the interior of the earth lodge, you would step into warmth. This temperature gradient served several purposes. First, and most importantly, it prevented cold air from flowing directly into the living space. The cold air was caught and held in the sump, unable to rise and enter the chamber. Fresh air still entered the lodge, because the fire's consumption of oxygen created a need for replacement air. But the air that made it through was tempered and moderated. As air moved through the tunnel, even the air that passed over the pool of cold air without sinking into it, it absorbed heat from the surrounding earth. The walls of the tunnel, warmed by the heat from the main chamber radiating through the ground, transferred some of their warmth to the air passing through. The earth acts as a thermal moderator, maintaining a relatively stable temperature throughout the year. In winter, the earth below the frost line stays warmer than the frigid outside air. This warmth, stored in the ground, was transferred to the incoming air. The transfer was steady and thorough. The air was not heated rapidly, which would create turbulence and drafts. Instead, it was warmed slowly as it moved through the long tunnel, making contact with the earthen walls, absorbing heat molecule by molecule. By the time the air reached the main chamber, it was no longer at the same temperature as the outside air. It might still be cool, perhaps 40 or 50 degrees when the outside temperature was far below zero, but it was no longer dangerously cold. It was tempered air, preconditioned by passage through the earth. This pre-warming was crucial for comfort. If frigid air had entered the lodge directly, it would have created drafts that chilled anyone sitting on the floor. It would have flowed across the ground like water, seeking the lowest points, making the entire floor level uncomfortably cold. But the pre-warmed air that emerged from the tunnel was only slightly cooler than the ambient temperature inside the lodge. It mixed slowly with the warm air, creating minimal disruption to the comfort of the occupants. The slow replacement of air also meant that the fire received a steady, predictable supply of oxygen. Fires do not respond well to sudden influxes of air. A sudden draft can cause flames to flare up uncontrollably, or it can scatter smoke and sparks, but a slow, steady supply of oxygen allows the fire to burn evenly and efficiently. The Earth Lodge tunnel provided exactly this kind of supply. Air trickled in constantly, drawn by the fire's needs, pre-warmed and moving slowly. The fire burned steadily, without fluctuation, producing consistent heat and minimal smoke. The tunnel also served practical purposes beyond its function as an air management system. It was a storage area, a space that was cooler than the main chamber, but not as cold as the outside. This intermediate temperature made it ideal for storing certain items. Firewood was stacked along the tunnel walls, arranged in neat piles that were easy to access. When someone needed to add wood to the fire, they would walk a few steps into the tunnel, select a piece and carry it back to the hearth. The wood stored here was kept dry by the roof over the tunnel, but it remained cool enough that it would not dry out excessively or become brittle. Tools that were not currently in use were also stored in the tunnel. Digging implements used for maintaining the gardens in summer were hung from pegs driven into the earthen walls. Extra cooking vessels, large pottery jars that were too bulky to keep inside the main chamber, were stored here. Hides that had been scraped but were waiting to be tanned were hung from poles strung across the width of the tunnel. The space was out of the way, not taking up room in the main living area, but still accessible when needed. The tunnel walls sometimes had small alcoves carved into them, creating recesses where smaller items could be stored. These alcoves might hold bags of dried corn, bundles of herbs, tools wrapped in leather, or other items that needed protection from the elements, but did not require the warmth of the main chamber. The cool, stable temperature of the tunnel was beneficial for some stored foods, helping to preserve them without freezing them. The construction of the tunnel required careful planning and considerable labour. It was typically built at the same time as the main chamber, as part of the initial excavation. The path of the tunnel was marked out and the earth was removed, to create the sloped passageway. The excavated earth was piled nearby to be used later as covering for the roof and walls. The sump at the lowest point was deliberately dug deeper, creating the depression that would trap cold air. Once the Earth Lodge framework was complete and the roof and walls were covered with earth, the tunnel was finished. A wooden framework was built over the tunnel to support a roof. This framework consisted of poles laid across the width of the tunnel, resting on the earth walls on either side. Over these poles, smaller branches and brush were laid, and then a layer of bark or hides. Finally, earth was piled on top, creating a covered passage that was protected from rain and snow. The entrance at the outer end of the tunnel was often covered with a hide or mat that could be pushed aside when someone entered or exited. This covering helped to reduce the amount of cold air entering the tunnel, though it was not sealed tightly. Some air exchange was necessary, and the covering was more about reducing wind than creating an airtight seal. In extremely cold weather, additional hides might be hung inside the tunnel, creating multiple barriers that further slowed the entry of cold air. Inside the tunnel, the floor was usually left as packed earth, though in some earth lodges, flat stones were laid to create a more stable walking surface. The stones also helped to conduct heat from the warmed earth below, making the tunnel floor slightly warmer underfoot. Some groups placed woven mats along the floor, creating a softer surface and adding a small amount of insulation between the feet of people walking through and the cold earth below. The tunnel was dark. No natural light reached it except for what filtered in through the entrance and what spilled from the main chamber. People moving through the tunnel did so slowly, allowing their eyes to adjust, feeling their way along the walls if necessary. Children learned to navigate it by touch and memory, knowing where the dips and rises were, where the wood was stacked, where to duck to avoid a low beam. The darkness was not frightening. It was familiar, a passage from one state to another, from the cold outside world to the warm interior. In winter, snow might drift across the entrance, partially blocking it. This was not usually a serious problem. The accumulation rarely became deep enough to completely block the passage, and it was easily cleared with a wooden shovel or simply by kicking it aside. In the worst storm, when snow piled deep, a path would be dug from the entrance outward, creating a trench that allowed access. This path would be maintained throughout the winter, widened and cleared as needed. The tunnel entrance itself became a landmark in the winter landscape. When the Earth Lodge was covered with snow and nearly invisible, the dark opening of the tunnel entrance marked the location of the dwelling. Smoke rising from the smoke hole at the top of the mound confirmed that The lodge was occupied, and the tunnel entrance was where you headed to gain access. Visitors arriving at a village would see these entrances dotting the landscape, dark rectangles in the white expanse of snow, each one leading down to a warm home beneath the earth. Walking through the tunnel was a transition, a passage from one world to another. Outside, the world was bright, cold and harsh. The wind blew, the snow fell, the air cut at exposed skin. But as you entered the tunnel and began to descend, the wind fell away. The sounds of the outside world became muffled, then silent. The cold lessened. By the time you reached the sump at the lowest point, you were already significantly warmer than you had been outside. And as you climbed the gentle rise toward the main chamber, warmth enveloped you. Emerging into the Earth Lodge from the tunnel was like stepping into a different season. The temperature difference could be 40 or 50 degrees or more. Outside it might be 20 below zero. Inside it might be 60 or 70 degrees. The contrast was striking, almost shocking in its intensity. Your cold cheeks would suddenly feel flushed with heat. Your cold hands would begin to tingle as blood flow returned. Your body would relax, tension you did not even know you were carrying melting away. The tunnel was more than a physical structure. It was a liminal space, a threshold between two worlds. It represented the ingenuity of the builders, who understood that you could use the earth itself, its mass and its stable temperature, to moderate the harshness of winter. The tunnel showed that with careful observation and thoughtful design, even the most extreme environment could be made comfortable. The cold trap was simple in concept, but profound in its effectiveness, a perfect example of working with natural forces rather than against them. The slow breath. The ventilation in an earth lodge was slow. It was not the active, wind-driven system of the tipi, nor the cooperatively managed system of the longhouse. It was passive, steady, and utterly reliable. The fire did all the work. The structure simply provided the pathways. The fire created a gentle upward draft. The heated air rose, carrying the smoke with it. As this air left through the smoke hole at the top of the dome, fresh air was drawn in through the entrance tunnel to replace it. The replacement was gradual, almost imperceptible. There were no gusts, no sudden shifts in air movement. The atmosphere inside the Earth Lodge was calm, still, undisturbed. You could light a candle and the flame would burn straight and steady. There were no drafts to make it flicker. This calmness was part of the comfort. The Earth Lodge did not require constant adjustment. The occupants did not need to watch the wind or reposition flaps or panels. They simply lived. The structure took care of itself. The fire burned, the smoke rose and left, fresh air entered, and the cycle continued without interruption. It was a system that worked on its own, requiring no intervention beyond feeding the fire and keeping the entrance clear. The thick earthen walls and roof absorbed the heat from the fire throughout the day. During the daylight hours, as the fire burned to cook food and provide warmth, the walls soaked up energy. The earth itself became a storage medium, a thermal battery. The mass of soil and clay, heated by the radiant warmth from the fire and from the warm air in the chamber, held this energy. It took hours for the walls to heat up, but once they were warm, they stayed warm for a long time. At night, when the fire was reduced to coals and the family prepared for sleep, the walls continued to radiate heat back into the space. This radiant warmth was gentle and even. It did not come from a single point, like the fire. It came from all around, from every surface, from the walls and the roof and even the floor, which had been warmed by the heat radiating downward throughout the day. You felt it on your skin, a penetrating warmth that did not rely on air movement. It warmed your body, your clothing, the furs you slept under, were total, immersive and deeply comforting. This radiant heat is different from the heat of flames, different even from the heat of a modern furnace. Flames produce convection heat, warming the air, and the air then warms you. Radiant heat warms you directly, through infrared radiation that travels from the hot surface to your body. You feel it on your skin, a gentle pressure of warmth. It is the warmth of the sun on a cool day, the warmth of standing near a brick wall that has been baking in sunlight. It is comfortable in a way that is difficult to describe, but immediately recognizable when you experience it. The Earth Lodge provided this kind of warmth. Even as the fire dimmed, even as the flames died away and only coals remained, the space remained warm. People could sleep without heavy coverings, without the need to huddle close to the hearth. The entire chamber was warm from the centre to the edges. Children could sleep near the walls without being cold. Elders, who felt the cold more keenly, were comfortable. The warmth was even, reliable, and constant. In the morning, the process began again. The coals from the night before were uncovered, still glowing faintly beneath their layer of ash. Fresh fuel was added, small sticks at first, then larger pieces of wood. The fire was revived, and within minutes flames were dancing again. The walls, still warm from the previous day, helped to heat the space quickly. It did not take long for the earth lodge to return to comfortable temperature. The thermal mass of the structure carried warmth from one day to the next, smoothing out the fluctuations, creating a stable environment. The wood burned in an earth lodge was hardwood, much like in the longhouse: oak, ash, cottonwood from the river valleys. The wood was cut and dried in the warmer months, a task that required significant labour. Trees were felled, the trunks were cut into manageable sections, and these sections were split into pieces that could be easily handled. The wood was then stacked in open areas where air could circulate, allowing it to dry. Dry wood burns hotter and cleaner than green wood. It produces less smoke and more heat. The preparation of firewood was one of the major tasks of summer and fall, and a single earth lodge required a significant amount of wood to get through the winter. The earth lodge was also remarkably durable. A well-built lodge could last for decades. The wooden posts and beams, protected by the earth covering, did not rot quickly. The earth was damp, yes, but the structure was designed to allow moisture to drain away. The floor was slightly higher than the surrounding ground level, preventing water from pooling inside. The earthen walls, once settled and compacted, were solid and strong. They did not erode easily. Repairs were minimal. Occasionally a section of the roof would need fresh sod, or a post would need to be replaced if it began to weaken. But these were small tasks compared to the work required to build a new structure. Many earth lodges were occupied for 20 or 30 years, sometimes longer, becoming permanent fixtures in the village landscape. The choice of fuel. Across all three dwelling types, the choice of fuel was critical. Not all wood burns the same. Not all materials produce the same quality of fire. The people who lived in these homes understood this deeply. They knew which trees to seek out, which branches to collect, which materials to avoid, and how to prepare the fuel for burning. This knowledge was as important as knowing how to build the structure itself. A well-designed dwelling with poor fuel is cold and smoky. A simple dwelling with good fuel can be warm and comfortable. Softwoods, like pine and spruce, are filled with resin. This resin is what makes pine smell so strongly when you cut into it. A sharp, clean scent that is unmistakable. The resin makes these woods easy to ignite. They catch fire quickly, almost eagerly. They burn with a bright, crackling flame that is cheerful and warm. For starting a fire, softwoods are excellent. A handful of dry pine needles, a few small sticks of pitch-heavy pine, and a spark or a coal, and you can turn nothing into flame in moments. The resin acts as a natural accelerant, catching and spreading the fire rapidly. But softwoods have a downside: they burn fast. They consume themselves quickly, and they do not produce a lasting bed of coals. Within minutes, the bright flames die down, and you are left with ash and a few small embers. To keep a softwood fire going, you must feed it constantly, adding more fuel almost as quickly as the last piece burns away. This is wasteful. It requires a large supply of wood, and it means someone must tend the fire constantly, never able to step away for long. Softwoods also produce a significant amount of smoke. The resin, as it burns, releases thick, dark smoke that can be acrid and irritating. In a poorly ventilated space, this smoke is unbearable. Even in a well-ventilated space, it is noticeable and unpleasant. For the long, steady warmth needed in winter, hardwoods were essential. Oak, hickory, maple, ash, these woods are dense. Their fibres are tight and heavy. A piece of hardwood is noticeably heavier than a piece of softwood of the same size. This density is what makes them burn differently. They take longer to catch fire. You cannot start a fire with hardwood alone. You need softwood or other kindling to get the flames going first, but once hardwood catches, once it is burning well, it burns slowly and evenly. It settles into a steady, quiet burn that can last for hours. Hardwoods produce a deep bed of hot coals. As the wood burns down, it does not turn to ash immediately. Instead, it becomes a mass of glowing embers, red and orange and intensely hot. These coals radiate heat continuously. They do not need flames to be effective. In fact, a bed of coals is far more efficient than a blazing fire. The coals burn almost completely, which means they produce very little smoke. The combustion is thorough, converting nearly all of the fuel into heat and carbon dioxide. The result is a fire that is clean, efficient, and long-lasting. The people who managed these fires knew to start with softwood, then transition to hardwood. The softwood got the fire going, creating the initial flames and heat. The hardwood kept it alive. By the time the softwood had burned away, the hardwood would be well established, glowing red and giving off steady warmth. This was the art of fire management, and it was practiced daily. You learned which wood was which by looking at it, by feeling its weight, by seeing how it split. Oak split clean with a satisfying crack. Cottonwood was softer, splitting easily but burning faster. Ash was prized because it could be burned even when green, though it was always better when dry. On the Great Plains, where trees were scarce, the fuel of choice was dried buffalo dung. This material, often called buffalo chips, was abundant wherever the great herds had passed. The buffalo left it behind in vast quantities, and once it dried in the sun, it became a perfect fuel for the small, controlled fires of the tipi. The chips were light and easy to carry. A child could gather a basketful in an afternoon. They stored well, stacking into neat piles that took up little space. Buffalo chips burn differently than wood. They do not flame brightly. Instead, they smoulder, burning slowly from the inside out. The fire is low and steady, producing consistent heat. The smell is not unpleasant. It has a faintly sweet, grassy scent, reminiscent of hay or dried grass. The smoke is minimal, just a light haze that rises cleanly from the fire. In the well-ventilated space of the tipi, this smoke is barely noticeable. You can sit inside for hours without your eyes watering or your throat tightening. The use of buffalo dung as fuel was practical, but it was also symbolic. The buffalo provided everything the plains peoples needed. Meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for thread, horn for implements, and even their dung provided warmth. The relationship with the buffalo was total, and it was acknowledged with gratitude. The buffalo was not just an animal, it was a partner, a source of life, and its presence was woven into every aspect of existence on the plains. The stone's memory. The hearth, in all three types of dwellings, was lined with stones. These stones were not decorative, they were not placed there for appearance or tradition alone. They were functional, and that they were chosen with great care. The selection of hearthstone was a serious matter, one that could affect the safety and comfort of the entire household. Not all rocks are suitable for a hearth. Some stones, when heated, can explode. This is not a minor inconvenience. It is a genuine danger. Rocks that contain moisture or that are porous can trap water inside. When the water heats up and turns to steam, the pressure builds rapidly. If the rock cannot release this pressure, it shatters violently, sending sharp fragments flying in all directions. A person sitting nearby could be seriously injured. Children playing near the fire could be struck. This was something that people learned to avoid, and the knowledge was passed down carefully. The best stones for a hearth are dense, non-porous rocks that do not absorb water. Granite works well. Basalt, the dark volcanic rock, is excellent. Certain types of sandstone can be used, as long as they are dense and dry. River stones, smooth and rounded by water, are generally avoided. They look appealing, but they often contain moisture trapped deep inside, and they are prone to exploding. Instead, people sought out rocks from dry areas, from hillsides and bluffs, stones that have been exposed to sun and wind for years. These rocks were tested, sometimes by heating them with a small fire and watching to see if they cracked or popped. Only after passing this test were they brought to the hearth. Soapstone, where it was available, was especially prized. Soapstone is soft enough to be carved with simple tools, but hard enough to withstand repeated heating and cooling. It has an exceptional ability to absorb and hold heat. A piece of soapstone heated in a fire will stay warm for hours, radiating gentle warmth long after the flames have died. Some groups carved bowls and vessels from soapstone, and these could be heated directly in the fire to cook stews or soups. The stone would hold the heat, keeping the food warm even after it was removed from the fire. The stones in a hearth serve multiple purposes. They contain the fire, keeping it from spreading to the floor or walls. They protect the ground beneath from the intense heat, preventing the earth from drying out and cracking. But their most important function is thermal storage. Rocks have what is called high thermal mass. This means they can absorb a large amount of heat energy and hold it for a long time. During the day, as the fire burns, the stones surrounding the hearth become hot. They soak up the heat, storing it in their mass, their atoms vibrating faster and faster as they absorb energy. At night, when the fire is banked and the flames die down to a faint glow, the stones begin to release this stored heat. This release is slow and steady. The stones do not cool quickly. They radiate warmth for hours, sometimes all through the night. This radiant heat is what allows people to sleep comfortably. The fire itself may be reduced to barely glowing coals, giving off very little direct heat, but the stones continue to warm the space. You can hold your hands near them and feel the heat radiating from their surface. You can sit close to them and feel the warmth seeping into your body. Radiant heat is different from convection heat. Convection heat is carried by moving air. Hot air rises from the fire, circulates through the room, and warms whatever it touches. If the air stops moving, the heat stops spreading. Radiant heat does not rely on air movement. It travels as infrared radiation, invisible waves of energy that move directly from the hot object to whatever is nearby. It warms your skin, your clothes, your body, without needing to warm the air in between. It penetrates in a way that convection heat does not. This is why a fire with a good ring of hearthstones feels warmer and more comfortable than a fire without them. It is also why the warmth lasts longer. The stones act as a buffer, smoothing out the fluctuations in temperature. When the fire is burning brightly, producing more heat than is needed, the stones absorb the excess, preventing the space from becoming too hot and stuffy. When the fire dies down, when less heat is being produced, the stones release their stored warmth, preventing the space from becoming too cold. The result is a stable, comfortable temperature that varies only slightly through the day and night. The preparation of the hearth was part of the construction of the dwelling. The stones were collected, tested, and arranged with care. They were placed in a circle or a ring, fitted together as closely as possible to create a solid barrier around the fire pit. A well-built hearth could last for years, for the entire lifetime of the dwelling. The stones would darken with use, stained by smoke and soot, blackened by the heat, but they remained functional. They became part of the home, as much a fixture as the walls or the roof. In the earth lodge, the central hearth was often larger and more elaborate than in the tipi or longhouse. The stones were carefully fitted together, creating a low wall around the fire pit. This wall not only contained the fire, but also provided a surface for setting pots and tools. It was a workspace as much as a heating element. You could place a clay pot on the edge of the hearth, near the coals but not directly in the flames, and the heat from the stones would warm it gently, cooking the food inside slowly and evenly. The hearth was also a sacred space. It was the centre of the home, the source of warmth and light. Many groups treated the fire itself as something worthy of respect, something that should not be treated carelessly. The person responsible for tending the fire took that responsibility seriously. Letting the fire go out was a failure. Allowing it to smoke excessively was a sign of poor management. Keeping the fire burning cleanly and steadily was a point of pride, a demonstration of skill and care. The fire was where life happened. It was where food was cooked, where people gathered, where warmth was found on the coldest nights. And the stones that surrounded it, silent and solid, were the memory of that warmth, holding it through the dark hours, giving it back slowly, steadily, a gift that continued long after the flames had faded. Winter is a force that demands respect. It is cold, persistent, and indifferent to human need. It does not care about your preparations, your hopes, or your plans. It arrives on schedule, and it stays as long as it chooses. For thousands of years, people across the northern landscapes of this continent faced this force and found ways not just to survive it, but to live through it with comfort, dignity, and grace. The solutions they developed were not accidents of good fortune. They were not stumbled upon by chance. They were the result of deep observation, careful thought, and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Each dwelling type, each system was refined over centuries, tested through countless winters, improved with each telling of the knowledge. The teepee, the longhouse, and the earth lodge were each perfect for their context. Each one solved the fundamental problem of bringing fire indoors without being overcome by smoke. Each one created a space of warmth, clarity, and calm. These were not simple shelters thrown together from available materials. They were systems, elegant and complex, that balanced heat, smoke, and fresh air with remarkable precision. They harnessed the wind, borrowed the stability of the earth, and managed the behavior of fire with careful attention. They were engineering achievements that rival anything built in stone or steel, not in scale perhaps, but certainly in sophistication and effectiveness. And at the centre of each there was the fire, the small, steady, carefully tended fire that was the heart of the home. Around it, families gathered. Stories were told, food was shared, tools were repaired, plans were made. Life continued, even as the world outside grew cold and dark. The fire was not just a source of heat. It was a presence, a companion, a reminder that warmth could be found even in the harshest circumstances. This is the legacy of the engineered hearth. Not just a way to stay warm, but a way to create home, a place of balance where the dangerous was made safe, where the wild was made gentle, where winter could be met with quiet confidence. A space where smoke rose cleanly, where air remained clear, where heat radiated from stones and earth and filled the dwelling with comfort. Rest well,